Houston rain doesn't fall. It rehearses. It taps the glass, tests the gutters, tunes itself on the street lights until it's ready to make an entrance. The night I left the dinner in River Oaks, the rain came in like it had been waiting for a cue. I stepped off the porch with my jaw set and my hands shaking, and by the time I hit the sidewalk, my dress had given up pretending to be anything but a second skin. Behind me, the front door closed with the soft, expensive confidence of a house that never had to fear a storm. I didn't run. Running looks like guilt, and I hadn't done anything wrong. I walked, heels slipping once on the neighbor's shining driveway, breath hitching at the memory of Mrs. Grant's voice. Measured, clinical, each word wiped clean before it left her mouth. It's not a question of kindness, dear. It's a question of fit. Tyler had sat right there, a hand on his napkin, eyes downcast like a student unsure of the answer. The servers moved around us like they were staging silence. The chandelier saw everything. I swallowed what I wanted to say and stood up before anyone had to pretend to help me with my chair. The rain did what it could to make me present. Cold on the scalp, cold at the back of the neck, cold at the waistline where a draft found me. I walked 2 blocks and slipped into the awning of a coffee shop that had closed an hour earlier, the chalkboard menu bleeding chocolate curls of ink. In the glass, my reflection looked like a woman you cross the street to avoid. Hair plastered, mascara drifting, shoulders squared by stubbornness. My phone buzzed once and went still. Not Tyler. Of course not. The person who had watched me drown in polite humiliation wasn't going to be the same person who offered a towel. I held my arms around myself and tried to slow my breathing down to something that felt like ownership. When the rain eased, I waved down a rideshare. The driver glanced up at me, glanced at the house behind me, and said nothing. It was the kind of silence I wanted. Practical, kind, uninterested in explaining itself. The city went by in a scrolling strip of neon and red brake lights. Midtown lifted its ordinary glow as if to say, "You're home." The scratch of gears on the light rail, the wet pavement shining like it's proud to be paved. I tipped too much when we stopped in front of my building. He deserved to carry a gentler story away from me than the one he had probably constructed. Inside my apartment, a cone of lamplight fell across the sewing table where my mother's Bernina sat, bobbin loaded with dove gray thread. I turned the lamp on and touched the machine's warm throat, the way you greet a dog in the dark. The smell of cotton and machine oil has been the background scent of my life since I was 9 and tall enough to press the pedal. We don't talk about money in my family. We talk about projects. Will the zipper hold? Can we save the hem? Would she like a new collar on that? We measure time in completed seams and the number of mornings a dress survives. My mother was asleep in the next room. She had left the kitchen neat. Cups stacked, spoon rinsed, a dish towel folded into something that looked like intention. I took a shower and cried into the hot water so it could take the credit. When I lay down, I stared at the ceiling fan and counted. The way you count when you're teaching a child to calm themselves. I tried on responses to Mrs. Grant's words like outfits I couldn't afford, an elegant refusal, a righteous speech, a laugh so dismissive it could knock a chandelier off its chain. None of them fit me. I fell asleep with the fan still turning and woke with a tightness in my chest, like I'd wrestled silence all night and lost. The next morning, the city offered truce. Wet air turned to steam on the sidewalk. I brought coffee to the sewing table and queued up a line of garments that had arrived with notes. Please fix before interview, urgent. Recital on Saturday, I'm mortified. Busted seam on a bridesmaid dress. Help. Mother's voices live in those notes, even when they're written by 20-somethings. The same hope for a quick rescue. The same small trust in a stranger's skill. My mother came out in her robe, hair pinned back, that composed look she wears when she's not sure if her body is going to cooperate. You heard the storm? She asked. I nodded. We didn't mention River Oaks. She doesn't like me out of place. Not because she hates those places, but because she worries they'll hate me. After lunch, I grabbed a tote bag of handoffs and walked to the bus stop for the 82. The air had the faint mineral taste of a day that still remembered being rain. On the bench, a woman in her 80s, white cardigan, small pearl studs, lipstick done with professional care, sat with a paper bag of groceries at her feet. She looked like she had taught generations to say please and thank you and to check their facts. Her hands trembled when she tried to lift the bag. "Let me," I said, and stood with it while she straightened. We talked exactly as much as two strangers should. I complimented the lipstick. She told me it was the only thing she bought at full price. She asked if I lived nearby, and I told her about the apartment. The studio dream I didn't call a dream because I'm superstitious. "Your mother?" she asked gently after I mentioned her. "She's a tailor, a seamstress, and everything," I said, and felt silly for the sudden thickness in my throat. When the bus arrived, I put my tote under my seat and her paper bag under hers. As we rode, I braced my hand on the pole in front of her every time the bus took a turn so that if she tipped, she'd tip into steadiness. At our transfer, she insisted on giving me her number on a small square of stationery. "In case you ever need someone to say something kind," she said. "We have to ration that these days." I laughed and tucked the paper into my wallet. That night, the kitchen smelled like garlic and doctors' offices. My mother had played herself too hard cleaning. She was pale, breath shorter than her patience. "Sit," I told her, and watched how her chest moved. Something in the cadence was wrong, a syncopation you can hear only if you've known the original song your whole life. She waved me off, but later, when she stood too quickly and gripped the counter, the wave failed her. I caught her elbows and felt a tremor I hadn't felt before. "We're going to the clinic," I said. She shook her head, then closed her eyes and nodded. Memorial Herman's ER knows two kinds of time: immediate and waiting. We got the waiting version, which is the one with fluorescent lights that pretend to be hopeful. When the nurse hooked my mother up to the monitor, I read numbers I shouldn't understand as well as I do. The attending was kind but collected, like he'd attended hundreds of families who wanted softness and didn't need it as much as they needed clarity. He said a phrase that stiffened my spine: severe aortic stenosis, and then spoke in clipped sentences about evaluation, risk, and surgery. He said a number. It could have been a social security number or a phone number, because it didn't belong to our life. I stood under the air vent outside the doors and called Tyler. He answered on the third ring, his voice a mixture of caution and that practiced warmth he used in meetings. I told him the diagnosis. I told him what the surgeon had said about the urgency. I told him I wouldn't ask if there was any other way. I didn't ask for a ring. I didn't even ask for a chair in a house like his. I asked for a bridge. There was a pause long enough for me to trace the memory of sunlight on his jaw from last fall, the day we thought we were doing something brave. When his voice came, it wore a tie. "I'm sorry, Maya," he said carefully, like the apology was a crystal glass he was carrying across a polished floor. "I'm not in a position to—" He stopped. "This isn't— Can I call you later?" The call cut. It didn't drop. It ended. I stared at my phone. People walked past with their lives strapped to them in tote bags and soft-sided coolers, the sound of their shoes loud in the hallway. I didn't tell my mother I had called him. I sat with her and kept my face arranged around ordinary words. Tests were scheduled. Forms appeared. A social worker with competent eyes walked us through what could be attempted. Insurance leads, charity pathways, time frames that sounded generous until you learned how fast certain kinds of hearts decide their own schedules. I sent emails to organizations whose names sounded like they rescued people. If they didn't, at least they rescued mornings. I kept my voice light at home because sound is a medicine you can give whether or not you can fill a prescription. 2 days later, the city put on its hot suit. Heat lifted off the pavement like a rumor, bending the air above parked cars. I came home from the hospital to grab my mother's cardigan and a book she liked to pretend to read. When I reached our building, an old sedan sat at the curb, idling like it had inherited the impatience of a long bloodline of idling cars. The passenger window rolled down, and the woman from the bus leaned out, a small smile erect on her face like a flag at half-mast. "I hope it's not a bad time," she said. The apartment looked smaller, with another person's kindness in it. She set the paper bag on the counter, cookies she'd baked, wrapped in wax paper like she expected them to be inspected, and asked after my mother with the caution of someone requesting access to a sacred place. When I told her the situation, she put a hand on the back of a chair and breathed once, something like a counted breath. "I have a grandson," she said, "who works with a fund. It's not magic, but sometimes it's enough." She took out her phone with the trembling dignity of someone reaching for a sword they can barely lift. "If you're comfortable, I can call him." Comfort isn't the right word for the moment you're drowning and someone offers you a rope. It's gratitude troubled by fear, relief complicated by a suspicion that you misunderstood the distance to shore. "Please," I said, and tried to keep my voice from sounding like begging. It isn't dignity that stops you from begging. It's the knowledge that by the time you're tempted, your dignity has already paid too much. He arrived late afternoon, a man in his early 30s with a posture that seemed a little too polite for his age. Ben Harris. Quiet shoes, careful watch, the kind of gentle handshake that tells you he has held hands in waiting rooms. He listened. He didn't rush the listening part. He asked if we had records, and I brought out the folder that had grown brittle in 2 days from the number of times I'd pressed it to my stomach. He skimmed and did the small nod that people do when they're putting pieces of a puzzle into a shape they've seen before. "We can do an evaluation," he said. "No promises, I never say promises. But we can try." The words were solid enough to lean a fraction of my weight against. That night, for the first time in a week, I fell asleep in less than an hour. Not because we were safe — safety has a different smell — but because there was a shape ahead of us that wasn't just a wall. In the morning, Ben texted, "Spoke with the hospital foundation and our board. Need one more doc from the cardiologist. Can you meet me at the clinic at 2? The words rearranged the molecules of the air in our kitchen. My mother watched me read the message. "Is it bad news?" she asked. "It's news," I said, and showed her. She smiled like a woman who knows the difference between a soft landing and a temporary reprieve and is willing to be grateful for either. At the clinic, the cardiologist provided the letter with the brisk kindness of a man who has learned to cover hard truths with a blanket of technique. Ben read it, then made 2 calls I could hear only half of. He paused after the second and looked at me with a face that made me think of the bus, how I had braced my hand so the old woman would have something to tip into. "We can fund the surgery," he said quietly, like he was careful not to startle hope. "It's approved. The hospital's on board. We'll coordinate with scheduling." I didn't cry right away. I looked past him at a poster that had a cartoon heart jogging up a hill. It looked stupid and brave at the same time, like anyone trying to live well. My mother put her hand on my wrist. "We'll bake for them," she said, and the future cracked open just enough to show a kitchen. The week rearranged itself into a preparation we hadn't known how to hope for. The date was set. Pre-op instructions arrived with the authority of a recipe we could follow. I filled a tote with what the internet told me to bring to a long hospital day. Charger, sweater, chapstick, patience. Ben didn't hover, but he checked in. Mrs. Harris insisted on sending sandwiches. I learned the names of nurses and the way they float through a ward like benevolent ghosts. Hands always where you need them, before you know you need them. The night before the surgery, Midtown was noisy in the way that makes solitude feel volitional. I stood by the window and watched late traffic move like a slow carousel. Somewhere, somebody's music was too loud. Somewhere, somebody was laughing into a phone about news that made tomorrow look generous. I thought of Tyler, of the way he held a glass at the base as if not to smudge its sides, and felt not anger, but a quiet distance. Some people are built for rooms that clap for them. Some of us are built for rooms that hum. I kissed my mother's forehead and set 3 alarms. We checked in before dawn. The waiting area held its usual congregation of anxiety. Families in hoodies, a priest with a soft briefcase, a kid clicking a Rubik's Cube with fast, deft hands, a retired couple holding travel mugs with both hands as if they were chalices. When they called my mother's name, she stood up smiling at the nurse, like a woman showing up for a job she intended to keep. I followed until the line on the floor told me to stop, and then I put my hand on my heart and waited for it to stand still long enough to hear the words that would come next. The pre-op nurse had a way of nodding that turned fear into homework. She repeated instructions in a cadence that felt like steps on a staircase. Gown, IV, consent, anesthesia. When they rolled my mother down the hall, I walked alongside until the double door swung inward, and a breath of filtered air pressed against my face. The anesthesiologist lifted a hand in a small salute I decided to accept as a benediction. Then the doors closed, and I was in the country called waiting, where the clocks all keep time but none of them tell the truth. I chose a chair that didn't face a TV. The woman across from me had a stack of crossword puzzles and a pencil she sharpened with a small pocket sharpener, a ritual that felt like faith. On the hour, a volunteer with a clipboard called names and reported statuses in phrases that tried to be both exact and kind. In procedure, making good progress, closing soon. When she said my mother's name with in procedure, I felt a loosening, as if some tendon in my chest had decided to cooperate. Ben arrived just after 8, coat folded over his arm, eyes the polite neutral of a man who has learned to show up without crowding the air. He sat 1 seat away, the respectful gap that says, "I'm here, not here to take." He asked if I'd eaten, and when I lied, he pretended to believe me and put a wrapped granola bar on the chair arm. We watched the volunteer make her rounds and exchange the occasional small remark about coffee, about the old man snoring gently in the corner, about the teenager whose Rubik's Cube had upgraded to speed mode. The quiet wasn't empty. It was populated with everything we were not saying. Around noon, the surgeon appeared in the doorway, cap lines still impressed on his forehead, mask hanging by one loop at his neck. He looked like a man bracing for either gratitude or questions and ready to meet both. "She did well," he said, in the tone of someone who doesn't use exclamation points but believes in them. He talked about valves and gradients and bypass times, the choreography of hands and machines that had kept my mother's heart occupied while a room of people asked it to change its habits. "She'll be in recovery for a while. You can see her later this afternoon." The words slotted into place like stitches catching both edges of a seam. I thanked him with the sincerity of a person whose vocabulary had become a small room with a single word in it. When he left, my legs trembled in that aftershock way your body has of informing you you've been pretending not to be afraid. Ben didn't say anything wise. He just let the moment have its own size. After a while, he stood. "I'll come back later," he said. "You don't need more people telling you things right now." He gave me a small wry smile. "Text if you want a sandwich delivery." I promised I would, and knew I wouldn't. But the promise itself felt like scaffolding. Recovery is a landscape of wires and soft beeps, of curtains that try to be doors and succeed only at suggestion. When I saw my mother, she looked both diminished and enlarged. Smaller in the bed, larger in the fact of her stillness. The nurse greeted me by my first name as if we'd met before in some pre-life orientation, and pointed out numbers on the monitor with the gentle pride of someone showing off a garden. "This is good," she said, fingertip indicating a line. "This too." I said thank you a dozen times. The word worn smooth like a stone I couldn't stop turning in my hand. My mother opened her eyes as if she'd remembered she had somewhere to be. I took her hand and told her about the volunteer with the clipboard and the kid with the cube and the surgeon with the quiet face. I told her things she didn't need to know so she could rest inside a story instead of a room. She squeezed my hand, faintly, twice. If you have ever hung a painting and stepped back to see that it was straight, you know the size of relief that entered my chest. The days after were a choreography of small obediences. Sit up, breathe deep into the spirometer, walk to the door, walk to the window, walk to the door again. The nurses spoke to her the way people speak to old friends they respect. Direct, warm, no babying. Ben visited briefly, careful to make it seem like he had an errand nearby and was just stopping in. Mrs. Harris came once, a scarf tied over her hair like she was doing kitchen work, and put a hand on my mother's shoulder with the authority of women who have seen more than one recovery and believe in all of them. No one from Tyler's world called. I found that I didn't want them to. The absence felt clean, like a shelf wiped down and ready for something you actually use. Discharge day arrived with its signature mixture of gratitude and terror. They handed me a stack of papers thick enough to alter a small table's wobble, and I listened to instructions as if they were music I would have to hum back later. At home, the apartment learned to accommodate new rhythms. The timer for meds, the chair by the window, now titled Walking Destination. The pitcher of water that became a kind of altar. My mother slept in sage-colored light, the late sun making a private cathedral of our curtains. When strength returned, it returned like a guest who knocked and then let themselves in. Small noises in the kitchen, a spoon clinking, the hum of the machine's light. One morning, I woke to find her sitting at the Bernina, hands resting on the table, not touching the machine, just greeting it. "Not yet," she said to me without looking up, "but soon." The word soon moved through our home like a forecast. Ben called to ask if we might consider a small program the fund ran with local artisans and small businesses, mentoring, a bit of seed support, a pop-up showcase to help with launch. "No branding strings," he said. "We like it when people get to call their own places by their own names." We met at a neighborhood cafe in Montrose, where the barista drew a fern on the foam of my latte. With such certainty, I wanted to hire him to teach a master class in confidence. He introduced me to a designer who specialized in sustainable textiles, and an alteration specialist who had turned church basement talent into a tidy storefront. They talked shop with my mother in a dialect I could follow but not speak. Stitch density, blind hems, feed dogs, the dignity of a well-fitted shoulder seam. The pop-up showcase, they explained, was a way to bring in clients who still believed tailor was a thing only movies had. I watched my mother sit taller as the conversation went on, a woman remembering her height. We made a plan. Not a dream. Dreams were too airy, and we both had learned the cost of falling through air. A plan. 6 weeks to soft open, 3 months to assign, 1 year to decide whether to move or make the apartment do a little more. We found a small space on a quiet strip in Montrose, a rectangle with decent light and bad flooring. The landlord looked like he had once tried to be an actor and had settled into the role of a man who knew the difference between "I'll think about it" and "no." He gave us a break on the first month because we were local and because, I suspect, he had a mother. We painted the walls a color that read like clean. We borrowed a dress form with a wobble and shimmed it with a folded business card. We brought the Bernina down the stairs like a queen being escorted to a coronation, the two of us balancing the weight, stopping twice to laugh at our own seriousness. The sign over the door would have to wait. For the first weeks, we taped paper to the window with printed letters. Elena and Maya, alterations. Bespoke. Repairs. People read it as they passed and tilted their heads the way you do when you decide a place belongs to the neighborhood. On opening day, Mrs. Harris arrived in a skirt the color of strength and declared the hem an inch too long. For luck, she said, and the small room filled with the gentle friction of fabric made right. A young teacher brought in a thrifted blazer with noble ambitions. A man came in with a suit for a court date he didn't wish to discuss. He left standing straighter, and I thought about how armor sometimes looks like wool. My mother's face acquired that look people get when they're both tired and exactly where they are meant to be. In the second week, while I was pinning a dress for a woman who said she hadn't liked her arms since 2008, I saw Tyler through the window. He'd cut his hair shorter. He stood on the sidewalk like a man waiting for the light to change, though there was no intersection. Our eyes met for a moment that didn't last long enough to force anything. He lifted a hand halfway, an ambiguous hello or apology. I nodded the way you nod to a neighbor you once disliked and now prefer not to remember. He didn't come in. The door stayed a boundary and also a mercy. That night the rain rehearsed again, tapping out confidence on the awning, practicing its lines. I stood in the doorway after we closed and watched the street. The sign we couldn't yet afford glowed in my imagination with a dignity that made me laugh at myself. I locked the door and turned the open sign to its blank side, which I had come to think of as a kind of prayer, not closed, but resting. We didn't become rich. We became busy, which is better. The fund didn't ask for a plaque, but we put a small handwritten card on the counter that said, "With gratitude to a neighbor's kindness." People asked about it sometimes, and I would tell them a version of the truth that focused on the parts that could help them walk out feeling steadier. Mrs. Harris came by on Thursdays with something wrapped in a tea towel, and my mother devised duties for her that looked like rest. On a Sunday afternoon in late fall, we hosted the pop-up showcase the program had suggested. We moved racks against the walls, set out folding chairs, and brewed coffee that tasted like resolve. The designer spoke for 10 minutes about fit as respect. The alteration specialist demonstrated how to rescue a stubborn zipper as if it were an act of diplomacy. I closed by telling a story about the first time my mother taught me to backstitch, how she'd said, "It's not about going backward. It's about making sure the beginning doesn't unravel." People nodded like their own beginnings had needed that advice. After they left, the shop was quiet in the way rooms are after kindness, as if the air has weight and you are grateful to carry it. I turned off the lights and stood in the half-dark with my mother. She touched the machine lightly, a gesture halfway between blessing and farewell, then laughed at herself and took her hand back. "Still here," she said, meaning the machine, the shop, us. I echoed her. Still here. The next morning, I found the slip of stationery the old woman had given me months before. The corners softened by the friction of being carried. I texted the number of photo of the shop as the light came in just right. All softness and promise. A row of jackets on a rack looking like they were about to step into their lives. For the record, I wrote, "Kindness works." A few minutes later, the 3 dots appeared. "It always has," came the reply. "We just forget until someone shows us." I keep expecting some dramatic epilogue, a confrontation in a grocery store aisle or a letter slid under a door. But quiet justice doesn't perform for an audience. It hangs curtains, it hems sleeves, it remembers measurements. It pays bills on time and learns the names of the morning regulars. It is the satisfaction of oiling a machine and hearing it purr because you bothered to care for it. Sometimes I walk by the coffee shop where I once stood under an awning, trying to own my breath. I think about the girl I was, wet, humiliated, angry at a chandelier for having an opinion. I don't want to rescue her. She did that herself. I want to tell her a joke about the way life pronounces the word fit when it means belonging and when it means narrowness, and how important it is to know the difference. I want to tell her she will one day stand in a doorway and watch the rain and feel that the world has a room with her name on it, On the day we could finally afford a sign, the installer asked what font we wanted. My mother looked at me, and I thought of every label she had ever sewn into a garment with thread that matched so well you hardly saw it, only the confidence it lent the seams. "Something you forget to notice because it feels right," I said. He nodded like he understood and reached for a book of samples. We chose a simple serif that looked like it had good posture. While he worked, Mrs. Harris arrived with a paper bag that was heavier than usual. Inside was an old wooden tailor's ruler, the numbers worn but readable, edges smoothed by decades of use. "I'm done with measurements," she said, placing it on the counter like a ceremonial baton. "Time for you to keep making things fit." I swallowed twice before I could answer. My mother touched the ruler reverently and then settled it on 2 small hooks behind the counter, the way you hang a photograph of someone who taught you the important parts. When the sign went up, we stood on the sidewalk and looked at it, the 3 of us, the way people look at a dawn they feel they have earned. Cars passed, ignoring our small triumph as the world does, and that felt perfect. The installer waved and drove off. My mother took my arm. "Open?" she asked. "Open," I said, and turned the sign to the side with the word that has come to mean more than it says. The bell over the door chimed, and a woman stepped in, holding a dress like a question. I smiled, felt the threads of my life pull snug, and said, "Let's see what we can do."